Yeah, U of A. Oh, yeah. I don't care. It's like a rivalry from sports.
Hey everybody, as we're getting our food and we're walking up to our guest speaker, the amazing Stacey Montooth. I have her bio. So she's a citizen of Walker River Paiute Nation, and she's the executive director of the Nevada Department of Native American Affairs. She was appointed by Governor Steve Sisolak on September 1st, 2019. And now she's under Governor Joe Lombardo, and she serves as the liaison between our 28 federally recognized tribal nations, bands, colonies, and the over 60,000 urban natives who choose to make Nevada their second home. She is a member of Governor Lombardo's cabinet. The Department of Native American Affairs was created by statute in 1965 to study matters affecting the social, economic welfare, and well-being of American Indians residing in Nevada, and serves as a liaison between tribal communities, tribal citizens, and the state. She's a direct descendant of a survivor of the Stewart Indian School, and Montooth is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. They spent over a decade in service to Nevada tribes, and from 2012 to 2019, she worked for the Reno-Sparks Indian Colony as the tribe's first public relations and community information officer. And during her 6-year tenure, she organized community events and implemented communication plans and campaigns on behalf of the tribe and thousands of people. She also served as a crucial liaison for press inquiries as well as legislation involving key tribal issues, including healthcare and taxation. And she's one of the very first people I met when I came to Nevada as a new Nevadan, and she's been one of the sweetest people ever. She's been welcoming to everybody. She's knowledgeable. She's always a text or a call or an email away. So I'm really honored that we get to have her here as like our tribal governance speaker for this semester. Please welcome Stacey Montooth.
Did you all hear that? I warned your professor to help me with time because I'll tell next Tuesday. She lets me. So I'm not going to tell you anything about myself. No, it's hello everybody. Again, my name is Stacey, and I am a citizen of the Walker River Paiute Nation. I'm here today because of my profession working for the state of Nevada. And I'm so honored. I can't thank your professor enough. It's great to have an opportunity to meet new people, to speak to young future leaders, but on Indigenous Peoples Day, it's even better. So this morning, make sure you watch the news. Didn't we? Okay. So my presentation is called "What Every Nevadan Should Know About the Great Basin Tribal Community." I need enter. Here we go. So it's very common for all of our Native American communities to start with the land acknowledgement. Those of you that are Native know that typically land acknowledgements are delivered by the highest ranking non-Native in the room. In this instance, that's not me, but it's so important, especially because I'm a Northern Paiute, to recognize that I'm here as a guest. I'm visiting the amazing Nubu lands, and this is a land acknowledgement that can be found on our website. If you'd like to go through it really carefully, feel free to tweak it, make it your own. I am today's presenter, but I want to underscore, I do not do this in a vacuum by any stretch of the imagination. So I wanted to make sure that you all are aware. We have the Department of Native American Affairs. It's got a 5-person appointed board. They are appointed by the governor, and we have some of those folks in the room today. We're going to have our required quarterly meeting tomorrow out at the Milwaukee Band of Paiutes. Their multi-purpose room. They're so gracious to host us. And then I also have staff that are in the room, and seriously could not do any of the work that I do without these great help. So I want to make sure you all are aware. I did in college take a few classroom management, classroom style courses, and I've learned that it's important before presentation, you let the folks know what they're going to learn. So today, I hope that you leave here armed with some really important facts, just basic information about our tribal nations. I want you to know a little bit about the history of the first people of this land. everybody should know the definition of sovereignty, not only because it is so vital to our tribal governments, but there's some other stuff going on the planet. Maybe you all have heard about, right? Two-state solutions, right? Recognizing a different state are in the news constantly. So sovereignty, big, scary French word, but it's really pretty basic. We want to talk a little bit about some of the constitutional legal precedents that have gotten our people to where we are today. And then I'm going to do my very, very best to leave a little extra time. That's again where I need your all help, so that if you have questions, or better yet, if any of the amazing folks in this room, we have state employees, we have attorneys in the room, we have entrepreneurs in the room, all from Indian country. I'd love to give them an opportunity to give us some input too. So let's talk about, I mentioned that I work for this state, and those of you that have paid attention have a lot of laws in the state of Nevada. Our legislature gets together every couple of years to decide how to refine those or even to add more. Today, I wanted to direct your attention to something we used to call AB 264. Specifically, now we refer to it as the consultation policy. So know that there's actually specific NRS, and the folks in the room helped us pass this, right? This law requires consultation between every state worker, state employee, state department, state head who has regular contact with our tribal governments or our tribal communities. The idea is to make sure that the state employees know about the history, those things that I said that we're going to learn about today. The idea is to develop positive government to government relationships. And I don't know if you all noticed, but we have 3 uniformed gentlemen in the room. So back behind Dr. Fenn, there are 3 of my colleagues from the Nevada Department of Forestry, and they're here today. Special invitation. Thank you for coming. Because one of the aspects of the consultation law is to have some sort of professional development for the state employees. So they're here to learn just like you all are. So thank you again for coming in today. I have a few quick slides. I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly. And at the end, I'm happy to share this, all these slides with anybody who would like. But this is what our country looked like. I mean, it's that's good. So this is what Turtle Island, part of Turtle Island looked like, you know, in the 1600s. And today we're going to concentrate on the Great Basin, and that's this pretty burnt orange part, right? Getting in the weeds a little bit, the Great Basin is not just a geographical reference, but it's actual geography. The beautiful Sierra Nevadas, the mountains make the lip, if you will, of this Great Basin. In our area where our ancestors lived traditionally for thousands and thousands of years, all the water stays within this area, right? The Great Basin. So this is a photo that I really like to share. It is the Great Basin in the 1800s. So prior to contact. That's my nice way of saying before non-natives came to this area, prior to contact. What I really want to bring to your attention is we superimposed our indigenous territories for the major groups, the Western Shoshone, the Southern Paiutes, the Northern Paiutes, and the Washoe, and then in the green, the Fort Mojave folks. But we superimposed what is now the United States map in this area on top of that. Note that prior to contact, our relatives had shared territories, right? We didn't have hard and fast borders. You can see these black, strict, straight lines that make up what is now Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Nevada. Our relatives actually shared places. If you watch Hollywood, you aren't left with that kind of impression, but the Paiutes, the Washos used to hunt, gather, and fish in some of the exact same areas. So this is what it looked like. And then you all know who went to Nevada high schools? When did Nevada become a state?
1910.
Somewhere around here.
CCSD.
Oh,
Stop it.
So that's a valley thing, Viking Valley thing.
I got streets, right?
1864.
There we go. I have smart.
My bad, that was Vegas. 1910 was Vegas.
You pass those back.
County 19.
Make sure he gets two. That might help. Okay, so 1864, this territory becomes a state, and that just flips Indian country on its head. We're no longer to follow the food. We're no longer continuing to be in touch with the environment and move with the seasons. This is what our tribal governments, our nations, where they're based now in 2025. And this is a map that I commandeered from Indian Territory, which still shows those original territories with the shading. I guess it doesn't help if I put that here, does it? Which still shows the indigenous territories with the shading, but it also gives you the numbers where you can see the exact headquarters, if you will, city halls for our tribal governments. We typically talk about the big four in this area. Again, we have Paiute people, we have Shoshone people, we have Washoe people, and Mojave people. So all of our tribal governments are connected to one of those groups. In some cases, we have some tribal nations that have more than one. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone Tribal Nation. Anybody here from Fallon? Yeah. Okay, so you probably know out in Stillwater, they accommodate both the Paiutes and the Shoshones, and that was done intentionally by the government when they made reservations. The Reno Sparks Indian Colony, which is in the heart of an urban area, they actually have Paiute, Shoshone, and Washoe people. So this is a diagram that the Department of Education, Ms. Verdina there, that they created to try to help everybody get a better handle on, okay, you're Paiute, no, you're Washoe. So something that I really want to underscore, and I hope you all already know this, is everybody, I know we have visitors, but who are our law students? So you all could give an entire presentation on this slide, I'm sure. Sometimes, let's just say the general public doesn't always understand the government to government relationship between our tribal nations and Uncle Sam. So this is a pretty straightforward a diagram. We know that we have the four sovereigns in the higher part of the diagram. The Constitution of the United States, it explicitly recognized four sovereigns, and one of those is tribal governments. So especially in this day and age, it's always important to emphasize that the I would call them essential services, education, and healthcare that are provided for Native Americans from the federal government, that those are based on a political status. That is because we are citizens of another nation. Doesn't have anything to do with the fact that we all have brown eyes or we used to all have brown hair, right? It doesn't have to do with what we look like or our ethnicity. It's about a political. So there are some pretty major policies that the federal government has researched, adopted, and then instituted for the entire Turtle Island, for all of Indian country. I wanted to outline those here, but I really wanted to bring a couple of them into focus, not only because today is Indigenous Peoples Day, but a little bit myopic. It's a little bit about my office. So one of the things I want you all to be aware of, it happened in 1819. This was in the very beginning of the establishment of this country. The federal government had an act. They passed through Congress, just like they are trying to do nowadays with laws, right? They passed a law in which organizations, usually religious affiliated organizations, and sometimes even citizens, even just people in this country, could apply for and receive $10,000. Remember, 1819, they got $10,000 if they completed this application and they proposed some kind of a program in which they agreed to help support the mainstream religious and basically to help assimilate our Native relatives. That actually led to the eventual more focused program of Indian boarding schools. The other part that I wanted to bring up to your attention is what happened in 1824. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established. So right now in 2025, well, let's say a week ago in 2025, when the federal government was still operating, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was responsible for administering those programs that I mentioned earlier, right? Health access, basic care, and then education access as well. And in some instances, the Bureau of Indian Education actually owns and, let's not say owns, they operate schools for grade school, K through 12. All of that is what they do now. But I really want you to know that it was actually established. The BIA was established so they could dole out these $10,000 awards to different individuals or religious organizations to help them civilize, right, the first people of this land. At that time, it's important for you to know that the BIA was under the purview of the Department of War. Anybody watching headlines nowadays, right? I'm sure all of Dr. Finn's students are aware that there is at least a verbal commitment to change this State Department back to the Department of War. I think that's very relevant, especially on Indigenous Peoples' Day. The other reason that I wanted to bring this up is because my office, the Department of Native American Affairs, we are actually located, we operate from a former boarding school. Just 3 miles from the state capitol is the former Stewart Indian Boarding School. And when the school was closed in 1980, the federal government and the state made an agreement to exchange that property. So it went from being in federal trust by Uncle Sam to the state of Nevada. They actually, I should give all credit where credit is due. The property was about 210 acres. Half of that property was returned to the Washoe people. It was theirs to begin with, but it was returned to the Washoe people. And today, you know, they have a subdivision, households, they have an amazing community center, right? The balance of the land and the water rights went to the state of Nevada. And in the covenants, in the deed for that property, it's required that the state of Nevada reserve at least 3 of the 69 remaining buildings for the preservation and support of the contemporary lifestyles of Native Americans. Because Serena, Lori, and I work out at that campus in the former superintendent's house, right? Our job is to improve the quality of life for our tribal nations and urban Indians. So very, very close and powerful tie to boarding schools. I should ask, for those of you who identify as Indigenous or Native American, did anybody go to a boarding school? Did anybody have a direct relative that went to a boarding school? Yeah. So some more data, some more facts for you to take home today. Perhaps you heard our representative from the university, I had already mentioned in the proclamation, 574 sovereign nations. So there are more countries within the United States than there are countries on the planet. And when I say sovereign nations, right, we're talking about the God-given right to govern themselves. Sometimes in this vicinity, you'll hear tribal governments mentioned as nations. Sometimes you'll hear them mentioned as bands, colonies. We have a lot of pueblos in the Southwest, rancherias, villages in Alaska. Rancherias are mostly in California. Reservations is actually, excuse me, colonies. Colonies is actually a term specific to Nevada. You talked again, or you heard this earlier in the proclamation. We have 20 federally recognized tribal nations. It's also important to know that 2 of our tribal nations, the Washoe Nation of Nevada and California, as well as the Timok Nation, they have a little different structure for their tribes. So in addition to what I would call the parent tribe, they also have either community councils or band councils. And those are separate land bases. And on those land bases, these governments have a local elected government as well. So often 28 tribal nations, they all have their own constitutions. Okay. And because it's Indigenous Peoples' Day, I think it's really important, especially for our new folks or people that aren't very familiar with Indian country. You should always know on whose Indigenous land are you. So I have taken some time and put in some of the most extraordinary vistas in the Great Basin, including Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is what we called it, down here in the south with our relatives at Fort Mojave. There's the Stillwater Marshes. We have these amazing sagebrush tulips down here in southern Nevada. Pyramid Lake. Has anybody been to Duck Water? This picture in Niue Land. They have amazing, amazing hot springs out there. You gotta go if you haven't. Take a spare tire. The roads are tough. Of course, just outside of Fallon, we have these amazing petroglyphs. If you've been to Pyramid Lake or even just seen the advertising for it, they have the amazing Stone Mother, these fantastic tufa stones, and the Stone Mother, that picture includes part of their creations. And then I'm not objective. This is my homeland. So that's the Walker Lake. So a couple of the myths that I want to try to bust. And again, these are not necessarily something that a law student or a UNLV student, even if they went to Clark County School District, might think, but there are Americans out there that think all the things that Native American leaders, our elders, our youth in a lot of instances, what they advocate for, folks will often shrug and say, but that was decades ago, right? It really wasn't. It wasn't. Now, I mentioned the place where I work used to be a boarding school. It closed in 1980. So for a lot of you that are in college, you know, that was when your parents were in high school, right? That wasn't that long ago. There's also a stereotype, and I don't want to say for sure that the guy that's the leader of the free world testified in front of Congress in the 80s and reinforced this stereotype. That didn't happen, but Indians do not look a certain way, right? There's this stereotype. Again, we all have long dark hair, we all have dark skin, dark eyes, we all speak monosyllabically. That's not the case. There's also this really crazy rumor that we're all rich. That's not the case. That really stems from 2 big misnomers. Probably the most popular one in this day and age, and it's funny because it's in Nevada, but the biggest misnomer is that we all own and have an interest in an Indian casino. That is not the case, right? In Nevada, we do have a handful, 5 tribes that have a compact, that have all their ducks in a row to operate a casino. But you all might know if you've had an opportunity to take a UNLV business class, right? There's already a saturated market when it comes to gaming. And so that's not a very profitable business for our tribal governments on one hand. On the other hand, in business, you learn location, 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 right? It's not a coincidence that our tribal reservations are in isolated, very remote rural areas, right? If, you know, Caesars decided today that they wanted to make a deal with my tribe, we would get no foot traffic. I mean, nobody goes out to the middle of the desert. It just doesn't make business sense. So believe you me, all Native Americans aren't connected to casinos and all Native Americans are not rich. The other reason that this is part of a misnomer is because there's this idea that Native Americans don't pay taxes. Serena, do you pay taxes?
Every day.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Tiger, do you pay taxes? So our reservations are held in trust, right? The federal government has made this agreement that you can use this land, you can build businesses, you can have houses there, but you don't ever actually own the land. The way our tax system is set up when it comes just to property tax, right? If you own a house in Nevada, unless you're on the reservation, you own that land, right? And then there are assessments made based on the value, and you pay property taxes that help often with school districts. Well, our Native people, our grandma lived in the same cute little greenhouse for over 56 years. She paid it off, but she never owned, she didn't have a title because she didn't own the land. So by the letter of the law, she wasn't required to pay property tax, right? But don't think for a second that Native people don't contribute in other ways. We go to 7-Eleven, we have to pay sales tax on our big gulp, or if we go to, you know, buy a car, all those sales taxes, right? We still pay those. So this slide, actually the next two are just to give you an idea. And certainly you can look in this room to know what an Indian looks like. So we have an artist, we have this young man in military uniform. He is an Army Ranger. We have a physician. We have the smartest 5th grader on the planet. She's related to me. We have an elder, we have firefighters, scholars, you know, kids that just go out and ride their bikes. I want to give you a little bit more data specific to our tribal governments here in the Great Basin. We've talked about 20 federally recognized tribes, 27 tribal governments. Of all of those, there are 17 health centers. I think it's really, really important. I mentioned earlier about the trust responsibility about healthcare. We only have 17 clinics is what we typically call them. And we call them clinics because that's where you go when you get sick, right? Ultimately, we want to have health centers where you go to stay healthy. But healthcare is really a huge concern. It's a big emphasis and priority for our tribal leaders. It's hard to even talk about that. Suicide is an epidemic in Indian country. In fact, for young men between teenage years and the early 20s, it's the second leading cause of death among our people. Suicide, right? Native Americans have the shortest life expectancy of any subpopulation in the country. And when you click onto the CDC website, and you ask them what it is for Native Americans, it's usually only about 10 to 12 years. I think right now in America, I think it's around 78 for Native Americans. But that's those that don't live on the reservation. When you live on the reservation, your life expectancy goes all the way down into the 50s, right? high school graduation rates, right? I'm so thrilled that there's so many Native learners in a college classroom. But in the state of Nevada, we are only graduating our high school students who identify as Native American at a 70% clip. 70%. That is almost 13 percentage points less than the average for the state of Nevada. A lot of work needs to be done in that area. Another priority of almost every tribal government, not just in our area, but on the entire Turtle Island, is language, right? We have unique cultures, we eat unique foods, we have unique songs and dances, but language is something that makes us stand apart, not just from the rest of American society, but even within our tribal governments, our tribal nations, right? Southern Paiute and Northern Paiute, a little bit alike, but the dialects really make it unique. I also want to share, again, because I often get to do this presentation to my fellow state employees who typically aren't Native, food is such a huge staple. Almost at every gathering, and we didn't talk about this in advance, but almost at every gathering, whether it's a business council meeting, whether it is a reading circle, whether it's to review a film, learn in a law class, there's always food. It's a sign of welcome. So just a little bit more, have I put you to sleep with statistics? So we have in this country of 341 million, we have 2.791 million who filled out that 2020 census and said, yep, I'm Native American. In this state, we have 111,000 self-identified, and that includes urban Indians, which is a really, in fact, our urban Indians make up more natives than those that are tribal citizens. I was sharing with the guys from forestry and somebody else in the room. Clark County has the largest growing indigenous population of any county in the entire United States. There are more Navajo people. Ooh, where's my Navajo? I was talking, yes. Not Alvin, I apologize, I forgot your name already. Russell is one of those Navajos that are living in Clark County. More in Clark County than anywhere except on the Navajo Nation. So I had mentioned the remote isolated areas. In Nevada, we use the term frontier to describe some of our reservations because they are beyond rural, right? I mentioned going to those amazing hot springs in Duckwater. I'm not kidding. You have to have a spare tire. The roads are all dirt and they are so bad and they're not maintained that typically everybody blows a tire when you're out there. So we have frontier tribes, we have rural tribes, but we also have three, including our amazing hosts, the Las Vegas Paiutes, and two others that are in urban areas, urban settings. And that's really got a lot of pros and cons. Maybe Professor Finn will invite me back someday and we'll talk about whether it's better to be urban. When it comes to economic development, it sure is, right? Talk to the Las Vegas Paiutes who have the biggest store, I guess it's the biggest cannabis storefront on the planet, right? But then you've got us poor Paiutes who, we get one car go past our reservation a day. That's heavy traffic, right? So please leave the room knowing that all Native Americans have dual citizenship. I am a Paiute, I am Numa. However, I'm also a very proud Nevadan as well. I get to vote for the governor, just like I get to vote for who's gonna operate my tribal council. And that's not just for those citizens in what is now Nevada, but for all of Turtle Island. So even if you don't live on your reservation, you're still a citizen. Or if you do live on your reservation, you're still a citizen of the state. Spirituality, that's always kind of a little bit of a dicey area to get into, whether we're talking mainstream religion or with Native people. Not very scientific, but most of the folks that I grew up with were either part of the Catholic Church or they were part of the LDS Church. And my very non-scientific research is that they have a big tenet of doing ministers and proselytizing, right? They're the folks that come and knock on your door. And I think that has a lot to do with why Native people have gone into those two structured or organized religion. A lot of our tribal communities now also incorporate formal religious practices into their everyday life or into their traditional beliefs too. So I mentioned the food, right? Always at tribal council meetings, always at after school programs, but often it's very, very common to start everything with a prayer, right? That doesn't happen when you go to the Clark County Commissioners meeting, right?
It's actually.
Does it? Do they pray? Yeah. Oh my gosh, learn something every day. I guess maybe the heathens in Churchill County. I also want you to keep in mind when I'm speaking about some of these characteristics, some of these qualities, one size doesn't fit all. So please, again, remember the Washoe folks have different songs. They have different, even traditional regalia is different from the Mojave folks. So there's not a one size fits all. I talked about how the languages are so different. The priorities for our tribal governments are different. The essential service priorities are different, right? The folks that are in the heart of downtown Reno and Sparks in northern Nevada, they don't have the same economic needs as the Yamba Nation, which, you know, is in the middle. Well, I guess they're halfway between Austin and Gabbs, right? There's no way to get there on paved roads. So I always include this slide because in the, oh gosh, at least 15 years I've been working in Indian country. This is the question I get most from non-natives is, what do we call you? Are you American Indian? Are you Native American? Are you indigenous? My answer is all of them, right? It really, everybody has a little different approach. I guess let's do a quick survey. So Miss Katie, how do you identify? Are you Native American, American Indian, indigenous?
I say indigenous.
You're indigenous. Commissioner Martinez?
Usually say Paiute citizen.
Paiute citizen. Lori, how do you want to be identified?
Native American.
Right. So I don't think that Miss Lori would throw her water on you if you called her indigenous instead. I mean, the most important part is if you don't know, to ask and just do it politely. That's the best way to learn. Some tribal governments, communities, they want to be referred to by their traditional names. We've been talking mostly about Nevada tribes, but our great relatives and huge allies from the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. I should get Miss Stops. Do you know how you mentioned it? How do we say people of the pines in their language? Right. I mean, they've sent out press releases. They've got a new logo. They've got videos because they want everybody to call them by their traditional name. My favorite is Indian too, by the way, the very bottom part. So myth or a tribal truth. So really quickly, and this is specifically focused at our friends that work for the state. Tribes are a good partner. Do you think that's true or false? It is true. It's absolutely true. And I'm not going to even think that you said that because you're a Native person as well. I just learned he's a relative from Hawaii. But absolutely, tribal governments are great regional partners. We have a lot of MOUs. My boss, Governor Lombardo, is very familiar with the memo of understanding between the Clark County Sheriff's Office and the Las Vegas Paiute. So a lot of times those memos of understanding or mutual aid agreements not only happen, but they're more comprehensive and sometimes more effective than we have county to county or state to county. There's this stereotype, and Ms. Ferdina, can you tell us, is this true or false? Things take much longer to get done when you work with the tribal government. True or false? And I see all the elected officials over here laughing. It's false. It is false. It is false. There are occasions when, unfortunately, it takes quite a while to get some kind of a project up off the ground, implemented, but I'm pretty sure stuff like that happens in the city of Las Vegas too. I know for a fact that the federal government sometimes takes a little while to get things done. So we already talked about taxes, so I'm not even going to touch on that. Here are the tribal truths, right? Without a doubt, Native people have pride in their culture. They have pride in the American flag. They have pride in being US citizens. There are more Native women who have voluntarily enlisted in the United States military more than any other subpopulation, right? We have every family, everybody has at least 3 or 4 aunties, uncles who have gone into the military. Honestly, Veterans Day might be the biggest holiday in Indian country than any other holiday. I mean, there's no higher status for Native American people than for someone to be a veteran of the United States military service. It's just that revered. Again, very spiritual, the core of our existence. One of the things that brings us all together, and not just the 20 tribal nations in our area, but not just actually in Turtle Island, but the whole country, the whole planet. Folks that are indigenous, it's their connection to the environment. That's what sets us apart. The love, the thought that our natural resources have a spirit, have a heartbeat, that they have just as much right as the person does. And then our reverence for elders. That's very, very indicative of our culture, right? There are PhDs. There are people that have master's degree, the knowledge keepers. So I want to ask you to keep in mind when you are communicating with tribal leaders, our elders, especially for me, it's hard not to talk as much as you listen, but really listen more than you talk. Sometimes people use this as a strategy in competitive negotiations where they're quiet, right? They're trying to make it full silence. That's not the way it is in Indian country. That's just part of the way we roll. So you have to wait. Don't be the first one to reply in those kinds of instances. It's gonna take a lot of work. It's gonna take a lot of work to get tribal leaders, elected officials to trust, hey, we got this great new idea for a walking trail. You know, we want you folks to come down and help us with labels for a walking trail. We want them to be in your language. Sounds like a great idea. It would be awesome. But I bet everybody in this room who's worked for a tribal government can tell you about some occasion where usually a government official has come and said, hey, we got this great idea. We're going to do all this stuff for you. And then the end product isn't what we agreed on or isn't what we started with. And all of a sudden, you know, these sacred terms, these sacred places that we share with you are all of a sudden all over YouTube or the World Wide Web. So it takes a lot of hard work. And yeah, don't be fooled. And we just have to blame your relatives. Thanks for laughing. All right. Don't get right down to business, just like Dr. Finn did here. Have some food, have some introductory conversation. Again, try to find out from the tribal governments, how do they refer to themselves? If you are doing some work with our amazing friends at the Palms. Find out how they say people of the pines in their language, right? And then you have to be careful about asking for specific data, right? I often joke, you know, the Prime Minister in Canada doesn't necessarily have to tell the United States president what their, you know, general fund is, right? So it's completely inappropriate for a non-native, specifically a non-native citizen, to ask, you know, well, what kind of per cap did you guys give out last year, right? Don't want to ask those kind of questions. So, I think some of these might be a little basic information, but I'm gonna ask you to look at the second entry. Prolonged eye contact is inappropriate. So I've been in a lot of events, especially with our veterans, military folks, where they're always talking about handshakes and look them in the eye. You know, that's better than a contract. In our culture, if you look somebody in the eye and you hold their gaze, that means that you are challenging them. So you can eventually just look at their nose, not their eyes, but look at their nose. You'll get away with it. So something that my office lives by, native laughter, humor is a coping mechanism. Sometimes we can be what seems to be inappropriate, but it really is a coping mechanism. Anybody been to Las Vegas? Excuse me, to Reno? So they have a women's march, and annually they always ask our relatives to lead the parade. So this is a stage picture from one of the last events that they had. What questions can I answer? I have Smarties for everybody, but if you ask the questions, get one first. Or can I ask Commissioner Martinez, what would you add? What did I forget? What do you want Nevada employees to know about tribal government? In 16
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Martin. I'm the former chairwoman for the Walker River Paiute tribe, but lying. It takes a long time. towards a tribal government. But once you build a relationship with them, then it's easy to get things going with tribal governments as well. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of our competitions only have 2-year terms, and that's why there's always a change in leadership. Longer, and that's why it is hard to build relationships with those tribal leaders because of those term limits. Elected officials in the tribal nations, but it's always good to know people like Stacey and Cal with the Secretary of State's office, and John, he does government affairs with tribes as well, and then the whole department, and just build key relationships for even in education, and then they could get a hold of those tribal leaders. But it's really good to see in law classes, especially informed about tribal nations, because it is confusing. So don't feel weird that it's really confusing, because even me being elected official in my tribal government, things were very confusing because everything is on system, not up to date. There are certain resolutions that are passed that we didn't know about, and different word, like she said. And one time we were at a commissioners meeting, and I think we had like an hour conversation about that word alone, and well, maybe it's sitting. That's what I would add to her.
Who else? Any questions?
I was just curious about any like traditional cultural hobbies that the indigenous people in this region do that is like
Do you
required.
watch the Olympics? The vast majority of sports that are included in the Olympics all started as Native American sports. Help me, we still have a traditional. Yeah, there's a kickball. Kickball is is very traditional. It falls into lacrosse or stole that, I think, from our Midwestern relatives.
Shawnee. Oh, yeah.
Does that help or?
Basket making.
Basket. So that actually was, it was a requirement. It wasn't a part of the hobby. Our baskets were because we should go to Walmart and buy a bowl, right? Or get a new water jug, right? So we used what Mother Earth provided. Often too, kind of were in the desert, and now they're selling for this $40 before. Collectors want to put them on shelves because they're so. Marty.
I'd like to add on that. So with a lot of the hobby. And the practice, like Stacey mentioned, came from necessity. Also, a lot of them were learned and taught to use at boarding schools. Because they were taken away. When they were turning to these schools to work. They were returning to matrons, coaches, makers. They would teach the new students. They become their drive. Now the girls, the word that I'm learning that girls work. They get in trouble. They have to sit with the matron. The matrons would start teaching them to teach. And so it wasn't always necessarily this bad. And then they also learned things. You're put on a reservation and you're given freaking fabric. So you start making those things are passed. And that will lapse because of the way. And those become our hobby later on.
Richie,
Yeah, I'll add on to that too if I can. So,
tell everybody who you are.
oh, my name is Richie Savage. My friends know Richie Savage. I'm here for Indian education for the Clark County School District. And I'm a citizen of the Chimawavy Indian tribe. We're Southern Paiutes out of San Bernardino, but I live and work here in my indigenous homeland in Las Vegas. So I work with a lot of students. And so what I wanted to add on is that a lot of our contemporary natives today and a lot of our students are practicing their indigeneity in their own ways that are like very contemporary. So we've seen huge movements in like skateboarding, like there's an Apache skateboarding team out of San Carlos. Yeah, so they're signed with like Etnies and everything right now. We had White Cloud play hockey for BGK. We just had a Potawatomi citizen play for the Aces. Right, shout out to just one.
Champion.
Exactly, yeah, huge. But on top of that, like the movie that was just on Netflix, Resball. So like some of things like basket making and ribbon skirts, like we see those practices done all the time. But then still like kids are taking their indigeneity and the things that they're just into for contemporary days and really making it their own. Like I think something big that we've taken from like ribbon skirts is kids really getting into the fashion industry and incorporating their indigeneity into fashion.
A great example. It is a perfect example.
Yeah, well, I think it's something that doesn't like put our youth in such like a box, right? But it's really hard, like when you mentioned that we have so many urban natives too. So a lot of them are like kind of like dying for their culture, right? And like how do we practice it? Well, the answer is like if you look at the youth, they're really practicing in their own ways and they're doing some cool stuff with it.
They're finding ways. In fact, on the way, we came from the Capitol yesterday in a car. We stopped at Snow Mountain, right? So the Las Vegas Paiutes, who, is there anybody in here from that tribal nation that could speak to this? So they have, it's my understanding, 1 mile proper, right? Like a square mile in the city limits, but they held their powwow, I guess, exit 66 was it? I mean, they go find an area that is a little more similar to what our relatives used to, where they used to hold those kind of gatherings.
That was
For the Snow
land.
Mountain?
Yeah, Snow Mountain there is a traditional area.
So, yeah, so they have two areas now. So that's on their reservation, Snow Mountain. And the colony, so they have two areas, and they've even had an amendment to their constitution. Because it used to be the Las Vegas Paiute tribe of the Paiute colony, and now they're just the Las Vegas Paiute tribe. Those pretty cool movements too.
That's awesome, yeah. Little tweak makes a big difference. Is there any other questions? Anything else? Do you guys have any feedback? So I see something is afoot back here. I had help in front, thank you both, not only with the Smarties, but they passed out some surveys. So again, I'm statutorily required to give this presentation to state employees. If I could get you all to fill out, those of you that got a survey, if you could fill that out, that's very, very helpful for refining this. And then I do have a gift. Everybody gave me everybody turn in a rep ticket. Very, very quickly, check your numbers, and I hope you're coming from my office. Who is 875? Oh, that's it. Done by one of our tribal elders, so. Yes, it matches your skirt.
We really want to thank Rebecca on this third time. We will welcome her back another day. In our way, we love to gift you with a blanket for coming all the way down here with 8th generation blanket. Thank you so much.
Oh my God.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Come back next year. We always like to do a lunch and learn. There's a class about to come in, about 5 minutes.
Nice to meet you. I met you.
Oh, yeah, we're at.
I'm coffee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.